The night my parents called me Darky and threw my life in trash bags, my aunt uttered 4 words that made them beg on their knees for my forgiveness. 3 garbage bags sat by the front door. My clothes were in one, my books were in another. The third had my winter coat stuffed on top of a broken picture frame, the glass still inside it. My mother stood with her arms crossed, not looking at me. My father held the door open with his foot. "Figure it out," Mom said. I was 18 years old and 4 days out from my high school graduation photos, the ones where I'm smiling in a blue cap and gown between 2 parents who wouldn't touch me. I asked her what I'd done. She didn't answer. My father answered for her. "You know what you did, Darky." That word had been in our house since I was old enough to understand it. He said it the way other fathers said a nickname, like it was affectionate, like it wasn't a slur he'd built out of my own skin. My sister Ivy stood halfway up the staircase, arms wrapped around herself, saying nothing. She was 20, 2 years older than me, and she kept her room. She kept her car, her allowance, her seat at the table. She was lighter than me, favored in a way nobody in that house ever had to explain out loud because everybody already understood it. I picked up the bags. The frame's broken glass cut my palm through the plastic, and I didn't say anything about it because saying something had never once changed anything in that house. And some instinct in me already understood this wasn't the moment to test that theory again. The porch light caught the blood beating along my thumb, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that it would stain the strap of my backpack if I wasn't careful, and somehow that small, practical thought was the only thing keeping me upright. My father shut the door before I reached the sidewalk. I stood under the streetlight on Rolling Road in Catonsville, Maryland, bleeding a little into a garbage bag when the door opened again. Just a crack. Ivy slipped out, glanced back at the house, and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Call her," she whispered. "Aunt Delphine, Mom's sister. Don't tell them I gave you this. They'll throw me out too." Then she was gone, and the porch light went dark, and I was alone with 3 bags and a phone number for a woman I didn't know existed until that exact moment. I called from the bus stop bench outside the CVS on Frederick Road. It rang twice. "Come now," the voice on the other end said, warm, sure of itself, like she'd been waiting years for this exact call. "Text me your address. I'm already getting my coat." I didn't know then that I just made the first phone call of the rest of my life. For 18 years, nobody in that house told me I had an aunt. My mother, Renata, grew up the younger of 2 daughters to a woman named Adize Okafor, who came to Maryland in 1979 with $400 and a suitcase of shea butter recipes, and built them over 3 decades into a modest but real business, Adize's Naturals, a hair and skincare line sold out of a shop in Ellicott City and later online. My mother worked the counter as a teenager. So did her older sister, Delphine, 7 years ahead of her. The 2 sisters were close once. Photographs my aunt later showed me from the 80s and 90s prove it. Matching Easter dresses, a shared bedroom, Delphine's arm slung over my mother's shoulder at a graduation. Something happened between them in 2003, the year my mother married my father, Curtis Bell, a man my grandmother distrusted on sight. Adize didn't attend the wedding. Delphine did, and it cost her. My mother told her afterward, according to Delphine, that if she couldn't fully celebrate the marriage, she couldn't be part of the family that came from it. They didn't speak again for 16 years. My grandmother died in 2014, 5 years before I was thrown out, and my mother didn't go to the funeral either. I only learned that detail much later, from Delphine, sitting at her kitchen table with a box of old photographs between us. My grandmother's shop sat on a corner lot in Ellicott City for almost 30 years, a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign that read, "80s Naturals," in gold letters my mother and Delphine used to touch up together every spring with a single small brush, according to Delphine, back when they still did anything together. My mother worked the register on weekends starting at 13. Delphine worked the formulas in the back room, learning the shea butter ratios and the packaging line, the parts of the business that actually mattered long-term. That difference, Delphine told me once, mattered more than either of them understood at the time. My mother liked the counter because customers complimented her. Delphine liked the back room because nobody was watching her at all. My father grew up 40 minutes northwest in Hagerstown, the younger of 2 boys, raised by a father who ran an auto parts store, and a mother who, by every account I've heard, kept a version of the exact same hierarchy in her own household. One brother favored, one brother tolerated. My father was the tolerated one. I didn't learn that until years later, from his own brother, my Uncle Wade, at a moment when it mattered less than it might have. I don't say this to excuse what he did. I say it because Delphine once told me, sitting on her back porch, that cruelty rarely invents itself from nothing. It usually just gets handed down, generation to generation, until somebody finally sets it down instead of passing it along. My father picked it back up and pointed it at me instead. There's a specific afternoon that Delphine and I have gone back over more than once, trying to locate exactly where things started curdling between the sisters. It was 2003, 6 weeks before the wedding. My mother brought my father to the shop to meet Adize for the first time. My grandmother, according to Delphine, was polite for exactly 11 minutes, made him a cup of tea, asked him 3 questions about his family, and then excused herself to the back room, where she told Delphine, in Igbo, so my father wouldn't understand, that she didn't trust the way he'd looked at the framed photograph of Adize's own mother on the shop wall. A dark-skinned woman in traditional dress, the same photograph, it turns out, that used to make my father visibly uncomfortable at our own house years later, until my mother finally took it down and put it in a closet to make more room. I was born in 2001, 2 years after Ivy. My mother is a deep, warm brown. My father is a pale, freckled white man from Hagerstown. Ivy came out closer to my father's coloring, a soft caramel that tanned gold in summer. I came out looking like my mother's side of the family, like my grandmother in the photographs, like a woman I never got to meet. Ivy's side of all this took me years to fully understand, mostly because for most of my childhood, I assumed being favored meant being fine. It didn't. Not entirely. She told me once, years later, that she used to lie awake some nights convinced that the only reason our parents loved her was an accident of genetics. house, that if she ever did anything wrong enough, they'd simply notice she wasn't actually that different from me underneath the coloring, and the whole arrangement would collapse. She became, by 13, almost pathologically obedient, terrified of losing a status she'd never actually asked for, and didn't fully believe she deserved. She got straight A's not because she loved school, but because a B felt like the first crack in a foundation she suspected was fake. She told me she used to cry in the bathroom on nights I got in trouble for things she knew, factually she'd also done, because some small, ashamed part of her understood exactly what was happening, and hated herself for staying quiet about it anyway. I don't say this to make her the second victim of that house, because the math was never remotely equal between us. I say it because our mother didn't just damage one daughter. She built a hierarchy that cost us both, in completely different currencies. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that made people believe me later. It wasn't one comment. It was a policy, applied for 18 years, so consistent it had its own internal logic. Ivy got a car for her 16th birthday, a used Honda Civic, $4,000, cash, no strings. When I turned 16 2 years later, I got a bus pass and a lecture about how driving lessons were expensive and money was tight that year. It wasn't tight. I found that out at the dinner table eventually, in front of witnesses. Ivy's school photos hung in the front hallway in matching gold frames, updated every September. Mine went in a drawer in the hallway closet in a manila envelope for safekeeping, my mother said, every single year for 18 years. When I was 12, my mother brought home a jar of skin lightening cream from a woman at her church. She set it on my bathroom counter without a word. I used it for 6 weeks because I thought that was what daughters did when their mothers handed them something in silence. My skin broke out in a rash across my cheeks that took 2 months to heal. She never apologized. She told me I must be allergic to something else. There was a night, the spring I turned 14, that I've come to think of as the first real crack, the one that told me everything I needed to know if I'd been paying attention. Ivy had a track meet. I had a spelling bee the same evening. The county finals, the kind of thing that only happens once. My parents went to the track meet. My grandmother's old neighbor, a woman named Corinne who used to babysit us both, drove me instead because she happened to be free, and because she'd apparently known my grandmother and felt some obligation I didn't understand yet. I won the spelling bee. I placed second in the state the next month. Nobody in my house asked to see the trophy. It's still in a box somewhere, I think. I never went looking for it. Corinne became, without either of us naming it that way, the closest thing I had to a safe adult for years. She lived 2 doors down, kept a spare key to her own house under the same fake rock every single family on that street used, and let me sit at her kitchen table doing homework most Tuesdays after school while my mother worked late. She never asked pointed questions about what went on in our house. She just fed me, listened when I talked, and once when I was 15, told me flatly that whatever was happening to me wasn't normal and wasn't my fault, and that she'd known my grandmother well enough, years back, to know exactly what kind of woman would have been furious to see it. I didn't understand the reference at the time. I understand it now. My freshman year English teacher, a woman named Ms. Okonkwo, noticed something too, in the quieter way teachers sometimes do. She kept a folder of my essays separate from the rest of the class, told me once that my writing had an old grief in it for someone so young, and encouraged me to keep a private journal, which I did, on and off, for years, filling 3 composition notebooks with things I never once said out loud in my own house. I still have them. I read from the first one occasionally when I want to remember precisely how early all of this actually started and how long I carried it alone before anyone outside that house was paying close enough attention to see it. Food worked the same way, if you looked closely, which I eventually learned to do. Ivy got seconds without asking. I got told to watch my portions, at 12 years old, at a normal, unremarkable weight, because my mother said certain body types ran in families, and she wanted to catch it early in me, though never in Ivy, who was built the exact same way I was. Birthdays followed the pattern too, precise enough that I eventually started keeping a mental ledger without meaning to. Ivy's 16th birthday was a rented event space in Columbia, 40 guests, a photo booth, a cake from a bakery in Annapolis that cost more than my entire wardrobe that year. My 16th birthday, 4 months earlier, was a box store cake eaten standing up in the kitchen because my mother said, "We'd already spent enough on the family this season," a sentence that made no sense until I understood, years later, exactly what the family had actually been spending on. My father's version of all this was different from my mother's, quieter, meaner in its own way. He didn't lecture. He nicknamed. Darky started as a joke he made once, at a 4th of July barbecue when I was maybe 10, in front of his brother and 2 of his co-workers, and when nobody in that yard corrected him, it just kept going. It became normal the way anything becomes normal if it happens enough times without consequence. My mother never told him to stop. Ivy flinched every time but never spoke either, and I learned, the way kids learn everything, that this was simply the shape of my family, the terms I lived under, and that asking for different terms would cost me something I couldn't afford yet. I want to say I fought back sooner. I didn't. I got good grades instead. I got a part-time job at a bookstore in the Arundel Mills Mall the summer I was 16 and saved what I could, because some instinct in me already understood I might need an exit fund someday, even before I had language for why. The night I got thrown out started over something almost embarrassingly small, which is, I've since learned, how it usually goes. I'd asked my father calmly at dinner why Ivy's tuition deposit for her sophomore year at Towson had already been paid in full, while I still didn't know if there'd be money for my own fall semester at community college, a fraction of the cost. He put his fork down. My mother's jaw tightened, and then it wasn't about tuition anymore. It was about everything. 15 minutes later, I was standing on the sidewalk with 3 garbage bags and a slur ringing in my ears, and somewhere inside that house, my sister was already reaching for a piece of paper with a phone number on it, because some part of her, even then, knew this day was coming, and had prepared for it in the only quiet way she could. Aunt Delphine's house was in Ellicott City, a stone-faced colonial off Frederick Road with a wreath on the door even though it was October. She opened it before I finished walking up the path, took one look at the bags in my hands, and went very still, not shocked, something colder than shocked, like a woman confirming a suspicion she'd been carrying a long time. "Inside," she said. "Now." She made tea I didn't drink and sat across from me at a kitchen table that smelled like cedar and shea butter. The same smell, I realized later, that clung to the old photographs of my grandmother's shop. I told her everything. The nickname, the lightning cream, the tuition, the manila envelope in the hallway closet. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her mug slowly on the table. "They're going to beg you to come back," she finally said. "Give it 2 weeks." I laughed, because it seemed impossible. My mother didn't beg. My mother issued verdicts. Delphine didn't laugh. She picked up her phone and, without asking my permission, texted someone. I found out days later it was my mother. The message was 6 words long. "Dinner Friday. Bring Curtis. Bring Ivy." The 2 weeks between that night and the dinner were, in their own way, worse than the night itself, because they were where I learned exactly what my parents were capable of when they thought they were still in control of the story. The first move came the next morning. My mother called my phone 11 times before 9 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. The message, when I finally listened, was soft, almost sweet, a version of her voice I barely recognized. She said she'd overreacted. She said the stress of the tuition conversation had gotten the better of her. She said I could come home whenever I wanted, no hard feelings, and wouldn't it be silly to involve Aunt Delphine in a family matter, given how unstable Delphine had always been. I hadn't said a single word about Delphine being unstable. My mother had decided, unprompted, that this was the narrative she needed, and she was already building it before I'd even had breakfast. I didn't call back. The second move came 2 days later, and it was Ivy's turn, though I don't believe she chose it for herself. She showed up at Delphine's door on a Sunday afternoon, visibly nervous, glancing over her shoulder at a car idling at the curb that I recognized as our father's. She said Mom had sent her to check on me, which we both knew wasn't true, because our mother had never once in 18 years sent anyone to check on me for my own sake. What she actually said, quietly, standing on the porch so our father couldn't hear through the car window, was that Mom kept crying at night, that the house felt wrong without me in it, that maybe if I just came home and apologized for the tuition thing, everyone could go back to normal. I asked her what, exactly, I was supposed to apologize for. She didn't have an answer. She just looked at her shoes. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't coming back to apologize for asking a fair question. She nodded like she expected that, hugged me hard on the porch, and got back into our father's car, where I could see him watching us in the rearview mirror the entire time, his jaw set in the exact way it always set, right before he said something designed to hurt. The third move was money, because with my parents, it was always eventually money. My mother texted me a photo of my old savings passbook, a relic from when I was 7, $100 my grandmother, whom I'd never met, had apparently left in my name before she died, held in an account my parents controlled. The text read, "This is yours, whenever you're ready to be part of this family again. Don't let Delphine turn you against us for her own reasons." I didn't know then what her own reasons meant. I would find out at dinner. The fourth move was the one that finally showed me the whole shape of the game. My father called Delphine's landline directly. I only knew because I was in the room when it rang and Delphine put it on speaker without telling him. He didn't ask for me. He asked Delphine, in a warm, reasonable voice completely unlike the one he'd used on the sidewalk, whether she understood what she was doing, stirring up a teenager's emotions during what he called a fragile time for this family. He said Renata's blood pressure had spiked. He said the doctor was concerned. He said, and I remember this exactly, "You always did like being the hero, Delphine. Don't make my daughter a project." He kept going for almost 2 full minutes, his voice sliding between reasonable and wounded and back again. The exact rhythm I'd grown up learning to predict. A rhythm designed to make the person listening feel unreasonable for not immediately agreeing. He brought up my grades, said he'd always been proud of them, as though pride he'd never once voiced to me directly could retroactively count for something now that it was useful. He brought up money, said he didn't want this to turn into something ugly about finances, a sentence that struck me, even then, as strange, since nobody had mentioned finances at all except him. Delphine let him talk himself all the way out, the way she'd apparently learned to do over 15 years of watching this family operate, and only spoke again once he'd gone quiet, waiting, clearly expecting some kind of concession. Delphine looked at me across the kitchen table while he talked, her expression unreadable, and said only, "Friday, 7 o'clock. Bring the whole family, Curtis, I insist," and hung up before he could answer. That was when I noticed the first thing that would matter later, though I didn't know it yet. On the counter beside Delphine's phone was a manila folder, thick, rubber-banded, with a single word written on the tab in her handwriting, "Trust." I asked her what it was. She said, "Paperwork. Nothing that concerns you yet," and put it in a drawer, and I let it go, because I had bigger, louder problems that week than a word on a folder. The fifth move came from my father again, but this time he skipped Delphine entirely and drove to Corinne's house instead, apparently hoping to find me there the way he used to when I was younger. Corinne told me about it that same evening, still visibly rattled. He'd stood on her porch and told her, calmly, that I was going through something, and that it would help if she encouraged me to come home before things got out of hand, a phrase Corinne said made the hair on her arms stand up, though she couldn't say exactly why at the time. She told him she hadn't seen me and shut the door. She called me the second his car pulled away. In the middle of that same restless week, my mother tried one more approach, this time leaning on extended family rather than on me directly. She called her cousin Odalis, the one relative who still occasionally checked in from New Jersey, and asked her to call me and talk some sense into me, framing the entire situation as a teenager's overreaction to normal parental discipline. Odalis called me that evening, clearly uncomfortable, clearly unsure what she'd actually been told versus what was true, and asked me carefully, without judgment, what had really happened. I told her about the manila envelope in the hallway closet. I told her about the nickname. There was a long silence silence on the line. And then Odalis said quietly that she remembered a Thanksgiving 4 years earlier where my father had made a comment about my attitude problem in front of the whole extended family while Ivy sat there in a new dress everyone had complimented, and that she'd felt uneasy about it for years without ever naming why. I should have said something that day, she told me. I'm saying something now instead. She called my mother back within the hour and told her plainly that she wouldn't be talking me into anything. That same week, mostly out of restlessness and a need to feel like I was doing something instead of just waiting for Friday, I spent an evening on Delphine's laptop looking up Whitfield Logistics, the company my father had claimed for years to work at as a regional sales director. I found a staff directory page, buried 3 clicks deep on their outdated website, listing every regional director by name and headshot. His name wasn't on it. I told myself there were a dozen boring explanations. An old website, a recent promotion not yet updated, a title change. I didn't push further that night. I didn't have to. Delphine, it turned out, already had the entire answer sitting in a folder in her kitchen drawer, 3 years ahead of me. The 6th move, the last one before Friday, was Ivy again, but a different Ivy this time. One who called me late on Thursday night sounding scared in a way I'd never heard from her. She said Mom had found the number for Delphine written on a sticky note in Ivy's desk drawer and put together that Ivy had given it to me. She said Mom hadn't yelled. She said that was worse. Mom had just looked at her for a long time and said very quietly that she hoped Ivy understood what loyalty meant in this family and what it would cost her if she forgot. Ivy asked me, voice shaking, if I thought Mom would actually pull her tuition money the way she'd threatened. I told her I didn't know. I told her I was sorry she'd gotten pulled into this. She said something then that I've never forgotten. She said, I used to think you had it worse than me. I didn't understand until this week that having it easier was its own kind of trap. Then she hung up before I could respond, and I sat in Delphine's guest room until 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, understanding for the first time that this dinner wasn't going to be about an apology at all. 2 nights before the dinner, Delphine called me into the kitchen after Ivy had gone to bed, and I understood immediately, from her face, that something had shifted. The folder marked Trust was gone from the drawer. In its place was a different one, thinner, newer, and she set it on the table between us like it might still be hot. I need you to see this before Friday, she said, not because I want to hurt you, because I don't want you walking into that room blind while everyone else already knows. Inside were printed screenshots, a week's worth of them, forwarded to her 2 days earlier by a woman she'd never met before that Tuesday. Sienna's mother, a woman named Rochelle, who had found her daughter sobbing in a parked car outside a CVS in Columbia and after an hour of gentle pressing had gotten the whole story out of her. Rochelle had done her own searching afterward, found an old family photo of my father on Ivy's public social media from years back, recognized him immediately, and eventually tracked down a mutual contact who led her to Delphine, the one adult in this tangled family it turned out, who several people independently trusted enough to call with terrible news. I sat at that table and read messages between a grown man and a teenager I'd known since she was 12 years old. Messages that spanned back further than the 6 months I would later hear about at dinner. Messages where he told her not to worry about her age, where he told her this was different from what people would assume, where he told her, 3 separate times, exactly how to lie to her own mother about where she'd been. I read the word pregnant in a text from Sienna to my father, and his response 20 minutes later, asking her to please not tell anyone yet. I didn't cry at that table. I went very quiet instead, the way I imagine people go quiet right before understanding something too large to process all at once. Every unequal dollar, every manila envelope in a closet, every night my mother stayed up worrying over appearances instead of her own daughters. All of it reorganized itself in my head around this one fact, sitting right there in black and white. My father hadn't just been cruel to me for 18 years. He'd been actively destroying someone else's daughter the entire time my mother was busy destroying hers. Does Mom know? I asked. Not yet, Delphine said. She will. Friday, in front of witnesses. The same way she made sure you'd never have witnesses for anything that happened to you. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Friday came fast and slow at the same time. Delphine cooked all afternoon. Jollof rice, fried plantain, a roast she'd started before dawn, filling the house with a smell that felt, absurdly, like comfort in the middle of a war. I asked her once, around 4 o'clock, if she was nervous. She was slicing plantain and didn't look up. I've been waiting 15 years for a reason, she said. I'm not nervous. I'm relieved. I didn't understand that sentence yet either. I understood it 40 minutes into dinner. They arrived at 7 exactly, which should have told me something because my father was never on time for anything that didn't benefit him. He walked in whistling, actually whistling, a man who believed he was about to attend the negotiated surrender of a runaway teenager. My mother had dressed up, a navy dress I recognized from church, and she air-kissed Delphine's cheek at the door like they'd never spent 16 years not speaking. Ivy came in last, eyes down, and squeezed my hand once at the table before letting go. For the first 20 minutes, it was almost normal. Small talk about the roast. My father complimented the wine, a bottle he didn't know Delphine had chosen specifically. A brand from a vineyard she later told me was owned by an old business partner of my grandmother's, which she found darkly funny in a way I only appreciated afterward. My mother asked me in front of everyone if I'd had time to think, in a tone that assumed the answer was obviously yes and obviously in her favor. Delphine set down her fork. Before we get to any of that, she said, calm as still water. I've been meaning to discuss your finances, Renata. My mother laughed, the same laugh she used at church when someone said something she found beneath her. We're doing great, actually. Curtis just got a bonus at Whitfield. That's interesting, Delphine said, because your mortgage payment bounced Tuesday. The table went silent. My father's fork clattered against his plate. That's a bank error, he said quickly. Too quickly. No error, Delphine said, swiping open a tablet she'd had waiting beside her plate the whole time. "I've been covering your mortgage for 15 years. I stopped this month." She turned the screen so my mother could see it. 15 years of transfers, dated and itemized. More money than I could process sitting at that table. The house payment, private school tuition before we switched to public, 2 cars, a country club membership I hadn't even known existed. All of it, quietly, from Delphine. "You're lying," my mother said, and her voice had gone thin and strange. "Call the bank yourself," Delphine said, "or call Whitfield Logistics. Ask for Curtis Bell's HR file." My father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. My mother turned to him slowly, like she already knew what was coming, and was praying she was wrong. "Curtis, you work at Whitfield." Delphine put the call on speaker before he could answer. A man's voice, polite, slightly confused, confirmed he'd never heard of a Curtis Bell in 15 years at that company. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "Where have you been going every day for the last 3 years?" Her voice cracked on the last word, then quieter, almost to herself. "Are you still meeting Sienna?" The name landed on that table like a dropped glass. My father went the color of old paper. Ivy's head snapped up so fast her chair jumped. "Sienna," she said. "My Sienna? Mom, she's pregnant. She told me last month she wasn't going to say who the father." Nobody finished a sentence for almost a full minute after that. My mother's breathing turned into short, sharp gasps. Ivy pressed both hands over her mouth. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles ached, watching a marriage and a friendship and a family collapse in real time under one fluorescent kitchen light. Delphine didn't flinch. She turned her tablet around a second time. A text thread, dated and time-stamped across 6 months, hotel confirmations under a name that wasn't his, messages telling an 18-year-old girl to delete her call history, to tell her own mother she was staying with a friend. My father tried to talk fast, tried to say Sienna had pursued him, that she was mature for her age, that nobody understood the pressure he'd been under. Delphine let him get about 30 seconds into it before she cut him off, flat and cold in a way I'd never heard a grown woman speak to a grown man. "She is Ivy's best friend," Delphine said. "She is 18 years old. You are 45. There is no version of this where you were not the adult responsible for what happened." My mother lunged across the table then, not at Delphine, at my father, and 2 plates went to the floor and shattered and wine bled dark into the white tablecloth. Ivy grabbed our mother's arm, screaming at her to stop, and my father's chair went over backward as he scrambled out of reach. "Sit down," Delphine said, and something in that voice, low and absolute, cut through the noise like a blade. "Or leave my house right now and never come back to it." Everyone froze. My mother sat, shaking, mascara starting to run. My father righted his chair and gripped the edge of the table like it was the only stable thing left in the room, which by that point it probably was. Ivy stood up again, slower this time, and looked at our father like she was seeing a stranger standing where her father used to be. "Sienna came here for sleepovers," she said, voice shaking but clear. "She slept in my room. She trusted this family." She turned to our mother and her voice hardened into something I'd never heard from my gentle, careful sister before. "You spent 18 years hating the way her skin looked," she said, pointing at me without looking away from our mother's face. "And the whole time your husband was preying on a teenager under your own roof." My father flinched like he'd been physically struck. My mother said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if she'd screamed. My father tried once more to reach for something resembling control of the room. He straightened his collar, an absurd, reflexive gesture, and said that everyone was overreacting, that this could all be handled privately, quietly, like adults, a phrase that landed so grotesquely given what the room had just learned about him that even my mother let out a short, disbelieving laugh through her tears. "Handled privately," she repeated. "The way you handled everything else privately for 3 years, Curtis? While I stood at that stove every night making dinner for a man who didn't even have a job to complain about?" It was, as far as I know, the closest my mother came that entire evening to seeing any part of the truth clearly, and even then, it was still entirely about her own humiliation, not once about mine. Delphine stood, calm in the middle of the wreckage, broken plates, wine-soaked cloth, a family in pieces on her kitchen floor, and said dinner was over. She said my parents had 24 hours to sign an agreement, mandatory family therapy, a full and equal restructuring of how their daughters were treated and funded going forward, real accountability with Sienna's family regardless of what it cost them legally, or every dollar Delphine had quietly funneled into their lives for 15 years would stop permanently. No negotiation, no second chances. My mother turned to me then, mascara streaked down her face, and begged, actually begged for me to come home, to stop tearing this family apart, as though I was the one who'd broken it. Something in me went very quiet and very clear. "You destroyed this family years before tonight," I told her. "I'm done being blamed for finally saying so." Delphine walked to the front door and held it open without another word. My parents shuffled out into the dark, my father silent, my mother sobbing, and the door clicked shut behind them with a sound so small it didn't match what it had just ended. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't, not by a long way, and the weeks that followed taught me more about my family than the 18 years that came before them. News like ours doesn't stay contained no matter how much you want it to. By the following Tuesday, Sienna's mother had filed a police report, not against Sienna, but flagging my father's relationship with her daughter, for a full legal review given Sienna's age at the time it began, 16 when it started, 18 when it became public. Ivy told me later that she sat with Sienna in her mother's living room for 4 hours that week, holding her hand while she cried, apologizing for a betrayal that was never Sienna's fault to begin with, and Sienna kept saying the same thing over and over, that he'd told her they were practically the same age at heart, that he'd made her feel chosen instead of used, and that it wasn't until she saw her own reflection in the hospital ultrasound room, 17 weeks along and utterly alone, that she understood exactly what had actually happened to her. My father lost more than his marriage that month. Whitfield Logistics wasn't lying about not knowing him. He had in fact been laid off from an actual lower position there almost 3 years earlier, and had never told my mother, driving to a Panera in Colombia 5 days a week instead, working odd freelance consulting gigs that paid a fraction of the salary he claimed, using Delphine's silent, unknowing money to cover the gap. When that story came out fully, it came out everywhere at once, to his brother, to my mother's church friends, to the country club that quietly declined to renew a membership nobody there had realized was already unpaid for 11 months. My mother standing at her own church took a similar hit, slower but just as final. She'd sung in the choir there for over a decade, sat on the hospitality committee, hosted the occasional potluck. Word of the divorce spread first, framed initially, through my mother's own telling, as a straightforward betrayal she alone had suffered. It held for a few weeks. Then Ivy, tired of watching our mother be comforted for a version of events that erased her own daughter's role in it, told two of the church's older women, quietly, after a Sunday service, that there was more to the story than infidelity, that there had been years of documented favoritism running underneath the marriage the whole time. My mother stopped attending within a month. She told Ivy it was because the building reminded her too much of better days. Ivy didn't correct her. My mother's family, the small circle of it that still spoke to her, split almost immediately. Dallas, who'd already refused to talk me back into that house the week before the dinner, called Delphine within a week of the confrontation itself and asked to help however she could. Horrified, she said, at how much worse the full picture had turned out to be than even the version I'd given her over the phone. Dallas ended up driving down from New Jersey the following weekend, sitting across from me at Delphine's table with a directness I wasn't used to from adults in my family, and telling me, plainly, that she'd wondered for years why I was never in any of the photos posted from family gatherings, and that she'd assumed, wrongly, that I simply preferred to avoid cameras. Nobody wants to be the relative who asks the uncomfortable question at Thanksgiving, she told me, twisting her napkin in her hands. I've thought about that every day since Delphine called me. I should have asked anyway. My mother's own best friend since childhood, a woman named Pamela who'd been at her wedding, stopped returning her calls within days of the story reaching her, and I heard from Ivy that my mother sat in her car outside Pamela's house for 40 minutes one evening, unable to make herself go to the door. I met Rochelle myself about a month after the dinner, at Delphine's kitchen table, the same table where I'd first read those screenshots. She thanked me, oddly, for something I hadn't actually done, for helping bring it into the light, and I told her honestly that Delphine had done the actual work, that I'd mostly just been a bystander to my own family's collapse. Rochelle shook her head at that. You stood in that sidewalk with garbage bags and made one phone call instead of going back inside and begging, she said. That's not nothing. That's the whole reason any of this got to happen at all. I didn't know what to do with that assessment for a long time. I think I still don't, fully. But I've stopped arguing with people who see it that way. Ivy and Sienna's reconciliation took longer, and was harder won than anything else that came out of that autumn. The first time they saw each other after the dinner, at Rochelle's kitchen table, Sienna could barely look up, convinced, she told Ivy later, that her best friend would hate her forever for what had happened, even though every rational part of her knew she'd been the one who was preyed upon, not the one who'd chosen any of it. Ivy sat with her for 4 straight hours that first afternoon, mostly in silence, occasionally saying only, "This isn't your fault," in different ways, until Sienna finally believed at least one version of the sentence enough to stop apologizing. It took months of slow, deliberate rebuilding, grocery runs together, a shared prenatal appointment Ivy drove her to when Rochelle couldn't get off work, long nights on the phone that had nothing to do with my father at all, before their friendship started to resemble what it had been before he ever inserted himself into it. Legally, things moved slower and uglier than the emotional fallout. My father was named in Sienna's family's complaint, and though the relationship had technically begun after Sienna turned 18 by a matter of weeks, the pattern of grooming behavior documented in those messages, the ones spanning back to when Sienna was still 16, made it a far more serious matter than a simple affair, and a lawyer Delphine connected Sienna's mother with made that very clear in the first meeting. My father hired his own attorney with money he didn't have, which meant, in the end, borrowing it from his brother, a loan I don't think has ever been repaid. My Uncle Wade drove down from Hagerstown himself once, unannounced, and sat with my father in his car outside Delphine's house for almost an hour, though he never came to the door. Ivy watched from the front window. She said their father just sat there with his head against the steering wheel most of the time, and that Wade did most of the talking, gesturing sharply at one point in a way that looked less like comfort and more like someone finally saying out loud the things everyone else in the family had spent decades not saying. Wade told me, months later, at a moment when I finally agreed to speak with him, that he'd loaned my father the $6,000 for the attorney because he's still my brother, but that it was the last thing he intended to give him, ever, for anything. The house on Rolling Road went up for sale within 4 months, once the divorce made it clear neither of them could afford to keep it alone, and certainly not together. It sold for less than my parents had hoped, enough to cover the second mortgage they'd secretly taken out 2 years earlier. Money, it turned out, that had gone partly toward the country club dues, and partly toward a hotel account under a fake name that Delphine's tablet had already shown all of us at dinner. My mother moved into a 1-bedroom apartment off Route 40. My father, once his own legal costs were settled, had almost nothing left standing between him and the version of his life he ended up living. My mother filed for divorce 11 days after that dinner. I found out from Ivy, not from her. Ivy moved out of the house within the month, unable, she told me, to keep sleeping down the hall from a mother who still, even then, hadn't fully reckoned with her own part in any of it, choosing instead to spend most of her energy raging at my father in private and almost none examining what she'd done to me. The two of us shared Delphine's guest room for the first 2 weeks, an old daybed pushed against the wall Ivy took without complaint, and it was strange, in a good way, to fall asleep across the room from my sister after a lifetime of separate, unequal spaces, comparing notes in the dark about a childhood we'd apparently lived through as though we'd grown up in 2 entirely different households under the same roof. Corinne came by Delphine's house more than once that fall, always with something small in hand, a casserole dish, or a bag of the specific brand of pretzels I used to eat at her kitchen table on Tuesdays. She and Delphine hit it off immediately, in the easy way of two women who'd both, in their own separate corners, spent years quietly watching out for a kid nobody else in the family seemed interested in protecting. Corinne told me once, sitting on Delphine's porch steps with a mug of tea going cold in her hands, that she'd almost said something formal years earlier, almost called a school counselor or a family services line, and had talked herself out of it every time because it felt like overstepping into a family that wasn't hers. I regret that, she said. I want you to know I regret that. I told her she didn't owe me an apology for showing up as much as she had. She didn't seem to fully believe me, and I've let her hold on to that guilt a little, honestly, because I think it comes from the same place as love, and I didn't want to argue her out of either one. The mandatory family therapy Delphine had insisted on that night at dinner started 3 weeks later in a small office in Columbia with a counselor named Dr. Frey, who specialized, uncomfortably fittingly, in family systems and colorism within mixed-race households. I went to 4 sessions before deciding I wasn't ready for a room that still centered my mother's feelings over my own healing, and Dr. Frey, to her credit, didn't push me to keep coming before I was. My mother, according to Ivy, who stuck it out longer than I did, spent most of the early sessions explaining her own mother's harshness toward her growing up, a woman named Grace who I never knew and who had, apparently, favored my mother's older sister for reasons nobody in that room could fully untangle. It took nearly a dozen sessions before my mother said, for the first time out loud, that she'd repeated a pattern instead of questioning it. She has never, as of this telling, said it to me directly. Ivy says she's getting there, slowly. I believe Ivy. I'm just not willing to wait around in the meantime. Ivy moved into Delphine's guest room for a while, the same room I'd been sleeping in, and for the first time in our lives we were under the same roof as equals, sharing a bathroom, splitting grocery runs, staying up too late some nights talking about a childhood we'd apparently experienced completely differently despite living it side by side. There was a night, maybe 3 weeks after the dinner, when I sat on Delphine's back porch and let myself grieve for a while, which surprised me because I'd expected to feel only relief. I grieved the mother I'd wanted instead of the one I had. I grieved birthdays that should have felt like mine and hadn't. I grieved a version of my father who existed only in the handful of photographs from before I was old enough to remember him being cruel, a young man holding a baby that was me, smiling like he meant it. I found one of those photographs in a box at Delphine's house that same week, actually, tucked behind a stack of old shop receipts. My father, at 26, holding me at maybe 4 months old on a hospital blanket, an expression on his face I never once saw directed at me again after I was old enough to understand what a face like that was supposed to mean. I kept the photograph. I still don't fully know why. Delphine came out and sat beside me without saying anything for a long time, and eventually she said the only thing that helped. You're allowed to miss something that was never actually good for you. That's not weakness. That's just what loving people costs. I asked her that same night whether she ever grieved the 16 years she'd lost with my mother, the sister she used to share a bedroom with, the woman in the graduation photograph with her arms slung easily around a version of Renata who didn't exist anymore, a version who apparently still laughed at the same jokes and still stayed up too late some nights doing each other's hair in the shop's back room after closing. She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. Every day, she finally said. Grief and rightness aren't opposites. I was right to wait. I still lost 16 years I'll never get back either way. She said it without bitterness, just a plain worn-in honesty, the kind that only comes from having sat with a loss long enough to stop fighting its shape. It was around that same time, 3 weeks out from the dinner almost exactly, that Delphine sat Ivy and me down at her kitchen table again, and this time her face wasn't calm at all. She pulled out the manila folder from the drawer, the one marked trust, and set it between us. There's something else, she said. Something I never told your mother I knew, and something I need both of you to hear from me before you hear it from anyone else. The folder held our grandmother's will, a document from 2014 that neither Ivy nor I had ever seen or even known existed. Adayez Okafor had left the bulk of Adayez's naturals, and a trust fund built from 30 years of its profits, split evenly between her 2 daughters, and, critically, held in equal reserve for any grandchildren, to be distributed at 25 or upon marriage, whichever came first, with one binding clause our mother had apparently never told either of us about. If it was ever documented that the funds, or the household they supported, were used to create unequal treatment between siblings based on any discriminatory basis, the trustee, Delphine, was granted legal authority to freeze the parental share entirely and administer the grandchildren's portions directly. My grandmother, it turned out, had lived through exactly this kind of favoritism in her own childhood in Lagos, decades earlier. Favoritism rooted in the same ugly logic that had shaped my own, and she'd written that clause into her will specifically because she suspected, even from a hospital bed near the end of her life, that history might repeat itself in a family she loved but no longer fully recognized. She'd never told my mother the clause existed. She'd told only Delphine and made her promise to watch quietly for 15 years if necessary and act only when the evidence was undeniable. Delphine told me more that afternoon than she'd told me in the 3 weeks I'd already been living under her roof. Adayez had been the darker of 2 sisters herself back in Lagos in the 1950s and had watched her own lighter-skinned sister receive the better marriage prospects, the family's limited savings, the unspoken deference of relatives who never once said the reason out loud but never needed to. She left that dynamic behind when she immigrated in 1979, built something entirely her own out of $400, and swore, according to Delphine, that no child of hers would ever grow up inside that same quiet arithmetic. When she saw the earliest signs of it starting in her own grandchildren decades later, she didn't confront my mother directly. She simply built a legal safeguard instead, patient and specific, the same way she'd built everything everything else in her life and trusted that if it was ever needed, someone would eventually have the evidence to use it properly. She used to tell me, Delphine said, turning one of the folder's pages over slowly, that some kinds of harm don't respond to conversation. They only respond to consequence. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I watched what happened to you. I've been documenting this since you were 9 years old, Delphine told me, and her voice, for the first time since I'd known her, wasn't steady. The school photos in the drawer, the lightning cream, the spelling bee. Every year I asked your mother small questions, testing her, hoping I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. I just didn't have enough until this month to invoke the clause without looking like I was tearing the family apart out of spite. I needed her to do that part herself, in front of witnesses, so nobody could ever say I manufactured it. I asked her why the mortgage. Why 15 years of silent money if she knew all along what was happening under that roof? Because your mother needed enough rope, Delphine said quietly, to eventually hang the truth in front of everyone who needed to see it. And because whatever she did to you, I couldn't let you lose the roof over your head while I waited for her to prove it to the rest of the world. It took me a long time to understand what that meant. She hadn't just been paying a bill. She'd been building a case for 15 years, one deposit at a time, patient in a way that still, to this day, humbles me when I think about it. I'll admit the money itself sat strangely with me for a long time. There's a particular discomfort in learning that your own healing arrived with a dollar figure attached, that a grandmother you never met had to legislate around your family's cruelty just to guarantee you a fair shot at anything. I remember asking Delphine, a few months into the process, whether taking the trust money made me complicit in something, whether there was a version of this where I should have refused it out of some abstract principle I couldn't fully name. She looked at me like I'd said something faintly ridiculous. Your grandmother built that business with her own hands specifically, so a girl like you would never have to ask that question, she said. Take the money, build something with it. That's the whole point. I did eventually let that argument win. I started community college that January, a semester later than planned, funded suddenly and completely differently than I'd ever expected. And I remember sitting in my first psychology class taking notes on attachment theory with a strange, dislocated feeling, like the professor was describing my own childhood, back to me using words I'd never had access to before. I made a friend that semester, a girl named Priya, who'd grown up in her own complicated house and recognized something in me before I'd said much of anything, and we spent a lot of long nights in the campus library, not really studying, just talking through what it meant to build an identity out from under a family that had spent years defining you against your will. Priya was the first person my own age I ever told the whole story to, start to finish, without flinching through any of it. And I remember she didn't say she was sorry, which every adult in my life had been saying by then in a way that had started to feel hollow. She just said, that explains so much about the way you apologize for taking up space, and went back to her textbook, and something about the plainness of that observation helped more than any amount of sympathy could have. The trust activated fully within 2 months. My mother's parental share was frozen. Ivy and I each came into a portion of it directly, administered by Delphine until we turned 25. More money than either of us had ever imagined having, though far less, Delphine was careful to tell us, than the years of unequal treatment could ever actually repay. My mother contested it briefly through her divorce attorney, and lost quickly and badly because the paper trail Delphine had built over 15 years didn't leave much room for argument. My mother has not, to this day, apologized to me directly. She sent one letter, 8 months later, that spent 4 paragraphs explaining her own childhood, before finally, briefly, in a single line near the bottom, saying she was sorry I'd felt unloved. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. I haven't answered it yet. I might, someday. I'm not there. Sienna's son was born the following April, 7 pounds 2 ounces, at Howard County General, and Ivy was in the waiting room the entire night, having promised months earlier that she wouldn't let Sienna go through it without someone from what remained of their old friendship physically present. I went too, mostly to sit with Ivy and bring her coffee she didn't drink, and I remember watching Rochelle pace that hallway at 3 in the morning, exhausted and furious and relieved all at once, and thinking that this particular waiting room held more honest love in it than my childhood house ever had, despite none of us actually being related by blood. My father was not there. He asked, weeks later, through his attorney, about visitation, and it took another 4 months of negotiation before anything was formalized, supervised, and limited, an arrangement Rochelle fought hard for, and ultimately won. My father is a different story, one with a smaller, sadder ending. Sienna's family ultimately declined to pursue full criminal charges, worn down by cost and grief and Sienna's own wish, expressed carefully to her mother, to simply be allowed to move forward and raise her son, born the following spring, without her whole life narrowing down to a courtroom. But my father lost everything anyway, in the slower, quieter way that sometimes matters more than a verdict. He lost his marriage. He lost the fiction of his career. He lost his brother's trust along with his brother's money. The last I heard, through Ivy, he was living above a garage in Hagerstown, working an actual sales job for the first time in years, sending Sienna $400 a month toward a child he's allowed supervised visits with twice a year. It's been 5 years now since the night those garbage bags sat by the front door. I finished my degree, psychology, with a focus unsurprisingly on family systems and adolescent development, paid for in full by a trust fund built by a grandmother I never met, who apparently understood exactly what my family was capable of before I was even born. I work now at a nonprofit in Baltimore that supports teenagers in unstable housing situations, a job I applied for the week I graduated without needing to explain to myself why it felt like the only honest option on the list. Most weeks I sit across from some kid who reminds me, in one detail or another, of exactly who I was on that sidewalk on Rolling Road, the too careful voice, the flinch at a raised hand that isn't even coming, the reflexive apology for taking up space in a room. I don't tell most of them my own story outright. I just make sure they know, as plainly as I can, that whatever brought them through our door wasn't their fault, and that the adults who failed them don't get the final word on who they become. Ivy and I are close now in a way we never were as kids. Close in the specific way people get when they've survived the same house from two completely different angles and finally compared notes. She's engaged to a quiet, steady man named Marcus, who Delphine approved of within about 10 minutes of meeting him, which in our family now counts as a formal blessing. Marcus proposed at the same shop location where our grandmother's business used to stand, a detail Ivy didn't plan but cried about anyway when she realized it afterward, standing on a corner that had been a nail salon for years by then but still, apparently, held something of Addie's in it for both of us. I'm the maid of honor. Sienna remarkably is one of the bridesmaids too, her son turning 4 this year, calling Ivy auntie at every family gathering that now, blessedly, doesn't include either of our parents unless everyone involved has agreed to it in advance. I still see Aunt Delphine every Sunday. She still cooks too much food out of habit, still keeps a folder of paperwork in a kitchen drawer, though these days it's mundane stuff, tax documents, business receipts, nothing that could end a marriage. Sometimes I catch her looking at me across the table the way she looked at me that very first night, on her porch, taking in 3 garbage bags and a girl she didn't yet know but had already decided to save. I still keep the manila envelope, the one with all my school photos in it, the one my mother used to hide in the hallway closet every September for 18 straight years. I found it in a box of things Ivy salvaged from the house before it sold, and I couldn't bring myself to throw it out, though I've never quite figured out why. Maybe it's proof, maybe it's just a reminder of exactly how long I let myself believe that being hidden was the same thing as being loved a little less conveniently. Either way, it sits in a drawer in my own apartment now, in Baltimore, next to a framed photo of Ivy, Delphine, and me from Ivy's engagement party last spring. 3 women who built something real out of what was left over. I don't tell this story for sympathy anymore. I tell it because somewhere out there is a kid standing on a sidewalk with their life zipped into plastic bags, waiting to find out if anyone is coming, and I want them to know that sometimes the person who saves you isn't the parent who was supposed to. Sometimes it's a stranger who's been quietly building a case for 15 years, waiting for the exact moment you'd need her most, and 4 simple words, spoken calmly at a dinner table, can undo damage that took nearly 2 decades to build. My aunt never raised her voice that night. She didn't have to. She just told the truth, patiently, until the people who'd spent my whole life hiding from it finally had nowhere left to look but at themselves. I think about the word my father used on that sidewalk more than I'd like to admit, the way he said it so casually, like it cost him nothing, like it had been sitting there loaded for years just waiting for a moment to fire. I don't carry it anymore the way I used to. Some nights I still hear it, in his voice, in the particular register he used when he thought no one outside the family was listening closely enough to object. But I've come to understand that the word was never actually about me. It was about a fear he never examined, a hierarchy he inherited and never questioned, a smallness in him he needed somewhere else to put. I just happened to be standing close enough to receive it for 18 years. I was never the mistake nobody explained to the neighbors. I was just the daughter nobody bothered protecting until somebody finally did.